Hello, my name is Nathan Ludlow, and I'll be presenting on my research at RIS 2023 this year. My research is in hierarchical learned risk-aware planning for modeling human driving behavior in virtual environments. The general summary of this work is that we want to be able to develop an accurate model of human driving behavior such that we can test autonomous vehicle frameworks in simulation. Now, autonomous vehicles are becoming much more commonplace on our roads nowadays, and an important aspect in widespread deployment of these vehicles is effective and safe testing of these vehicles, and especially these vehicles as they interact with humans. However, testing this can be very dangerous, costly, and time inefficient to do so in person because it can be very difficult to test these vehicles in near-crash situations without damaging equipment or putting people at risk. And so simulation offers a very appealing alternative to be able to quickly, efficiently, and cheaply be able to simulate these vehicles. However, it is not possible to simulate these vehicle interactions with humans without having some sort of model of human driving behavior that these autonomous vehicle frameworks can interact with. So we propose a simple model of reflecting human behavior in this simulated model by predicting the trajectory of all surrounding vehicles to this ego vehicle that we want to replicate the human behavior in, and then planning a risk-aware cost grid that we can navigate through. We then learn certain parameters from human driving data that we feed as part of the cost function in this risk-aware planning to more accurately represent these specific human driving behaviors, and we also we have optional driving parameters that can be specified to simulate different kinds of drivers. And so out of this framework comes different plan trajectories that reflect human-like motions that can be performed. So in order to generate these risk fields, this is a simple example of a single time step of a risk field generation. We take the surrounding positions of all of the vehicles and use a higher order elliptical Gaussian function to produce these risky areas of the road, higher risk being in yellow, lower risk being in blue, and this allows the vehicle to navigate through it. Now this shows only one time step, which has been used in the past for many works with risk navigation. However, the shortcoming with this is that it gives very short time frame predictions of risk around all of these vehicles, and so that's why in our model we fuse this trajectory prediction module and predict a risk grid for each predicted position of these vehicles up to 5 seconds in the future and then navigate through that. And this allows us to perform many different and new higher level maneuvers such as overtaking multiple vehicles, which with this single time step risk planning wasn't previously possible, just since the cost would never decrease in passing multiple vehicles or longer vehicles, as well as allows us to perform more maneuvers of weaving through traffic and determining those kinds of higher level maneuvers that humans think of when they drive their vehicles. In order to navigate this risk field, here we have a sample generated image of the risk with multiple time steps of planning in these risk generations. And you'll notice that in this, the risks that are further out in the future are visualized with a lower level of risk for the sake of this visualization. We then plan this lowest cost function through it. However, this lowest cost function doesn't create human driving behavior on its own, and so that is why we use these learned parameters. These learned parameters, we take ngsim data and process through it to find different driving maneuvers and behaviors, and then determine how humans behave in different situations so that we can tune the cost functions to behave the same way. Initially, we divided into these low risk, medium risk, high risk areas, where low risk was representing the free driving space. Medium risk was a normal driving space along a highway with some cars present but not much danger, and high risk was congested traffic or bumper-to-bumper traffic or vehicles engaging in risky maneuvers. We took these learned parameters based on some work done by Melissa Pearson and validated them. We found that as your forward velocity decreases on the highway, your risk increases, which is intuitive as vehicles are traveling at high speed along the highway, and so traveling slower than those vehicles is more risky. And then as your lateral velocity increases during a lane change maneuver, your risk increases, which is intuitive as well, as faster lane changes are more dangerous. We went ahead and continued learning more parameters. We wanted to learn how drivers associate with different lanes along the road and the risk associated with them. So we went ahead and learned the risk for being in a certain lane relative to the speed of the vehicle compared to the average velocity of that lane. And so we find intuitively that going at the same speed as the average velocity in that lane is the safest option. Going faster or slower increases your risk. However, going faster is safer than going slower on this highway. We also found that the left lane tends to be the safest, with the right lane falling as the second safest, which makes sense as the middle lanes is where most lane change maneuvers occur as vehicles try to either make it to the left lane or right lane. And as they move around, there are many, many vehicles in the middle lanes in this simulation. Taking these these learned cost functions, we can apply these again to our model and go ahead and validate it. We validated it on the other half of our ngsim data that we had, where we would replace one of the vehicles that was performing a lane change maneuver with our vehicle model and see if it was capable of predicting the trajectory of the vehicle and that lane change maneuver. Here we have two simple examples where the actual maneuver performed by the vehicle is in red and our predicted trajectory is in blue. Some of the results we found were that we were able to identify somewhere between 75 and 83% of these lane change maneuvers. We segregated the drivers by aggressive, average, and conservative by observing the lateral accelerations and the longitudinal accelerations of the drivers and dividing them into quartiles. The aggressive drivers, average drivers, and conservative drivers use different driver parameters in the model. We also found that we're able to reasonably closely predict the final and average error of the trajectories. Most of this error comes from the longitudinal distance of the vehicles from its final position. Here we have some videos that show different maneuvers this vehicle framework is able to create. We have the ego vehicle here in the center in blue with the planned trajectory in this pinkish purple going out from it. As the vehicle travels along in this case, it is a more conservative driver, and so it chooses to stay in its lane and follow these surrounding vehicles rather than try and leave its lane, as staying in its lane is the safest option rather than traveling through this more risky area, which is representative of a large number of driving cases where drivers choose to stay in their lane in these more risky, congested areas. Next, we have another example of a much more risky driver navigating through and weaving through traffic. In this case, the driver chooses to change lanes to avoid these vehicles, to change lanes to move back. We'll notice at the end that it will perform one last lane change maneuver to this leftmost lane, which comes from these learned parameters where this driver, since it's traveling at a much higher speed than the other drivers, tends to prefer to be in the leftmost lane as the average velocity of the leftmost lane is the highest, which is representative of human driving behaviors where we will tend to the leftmost lane when we want to travel faster as it is the fastest moving lane of traffic. Moving on, one last example we have is where the ego vehicle, again in blue, chooses to move out of its lane to allow a faster oncoming vehicle to overtake it. This represents a much safer, more conservative driver, where in order to preserve its safety, it will leave its lane and allow the vehicle behind it to pass. Some summary of this results and work. There has been some past work in this human modeling for autonomous vehicles. Our work offers some distinct advantages. The trajectories that it generates can be new and interpretable rather than just replicating existing data, as some of the learned models for replicating human behavior tend to. Our model also easily adapts to situations never before seen in data, as it's generally very rule-based. It's easy to change the orientation and configuration of cars and see the model still work very effectively. It's also capable of modeling multiple styles of driving with aggressive and conservative drivers. It easily adapts to new scenarios and would be easy to tune to something like an intersection or neighborhood driving as well. It's very easy to learn these cost parameters for tailoring the model to human driving, and more could be learned for more accurate representation of human drivers. And then it computes itself in a very short time, all of the planning, which allows it to be used very effectively in simulation environments where runtimes are very important for being able to test many, many different situations and scenarios. Some future research we would like to explore is modeling more driver traits in the framework, such as distractedness, learning more parameters to see if we can more accurately replicate more human behavior, learning the a controller for path following as well, rather than just planning these trajectories, and then adding stochastic behavior to the driver model to represent some of the uncertainty. I'd like to give thanks as well to all the sponsors and mentors that made this research possible, and especially thanks to the CMU Center for Autonomous Vehicles with Dr. John Dolan and Yue Liu for supporting me in this research, as well as the RISC team and Rachel Burson for making this opportunity possible.